for the bleeding. Okay, well that's appropriate for Halloween. I'm not talking about that kind of bleeding. Today we're gonna talk about color bleeding when you block your items. Some would argue even scarier. Hello, and welcome to Bla Bla Black Sheep, a weekly yarny podcast where I, Sarah Korth of SEK Handmade, answer your yarny questions. Welcome. I am so glad you're here. Today, my friends, I'm going to be wearing my Odessa gray shawl. I'm loving it so much. The weather has ticked back up a little bit in temperature, to which I say blech, because this is the coziest shawl and I just want to wear it all the time. But we're not quite there yet. It's fine. I'm sure I'll get plenty of chilly days once winter rolls around. So I have my striped shawl here. It is taller, longer, bigger, generally speaking. I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of toss it over one shoulder, my center V kind of off to the side, and I don't know, let's see, I think I'm gonna squish it up a little bit so that it's not covering my arms, and then Weston's here too. Then I'm just gonna kind of wrap up and around, and then you know what, let's try this. Let's to kind of lock that in place, wrap it around the middle. What do we think about that? Put this back up through the loop. Where's my loop here? Kind of like that. No, I don't love that. Down through the loop. Make a little knot. That's better. Let's try that. So this is my brand new Odessa gray shawl. It's got a great shape to it that makes it super easy to wear, and as I said, I'm going to be wearing it all winter long. Links to the pattern and the introduction video and this gorgeous yarn are all in the show notes below, so you don't need to hunt them down. I got you covered. Let's get to today's question. My friend made the most beautiful shawl, and when she went to block it, some of the dye ran from one section and stained another. It makes me so scared to block my projects. How can I avoid this? Right? There is nothing worse than putting a whole bunch of time and energy into a project, going to block it, and then it getting stained when the colors move around and don't stay where they're supposed to. For me, as someone who makes a lot of things and blocks a lot of things, this is a pretty uncommon occurrence. So it has happened to me maybe twice. Generally speaking, this is not an issue that you need to be super concerned about. However, since the results are so awful, I understand why it's something that kind of haunts us. Haunts us, Halloween. Funny when I don't even try to be. So let's start off by talking about why this happens. There are a few reasons why your yarn can bleed. Some of them are things that you have control of, and some of the things are things you don't have control over. So first, let's talk about the things you don't have control over. There are things that companies and dyers do that either cause their yarn to bleed more or less. There are some dyers who don't rinse their yarn enough for whatever reason. Dyeing yarn is a lot of physical work, especially for small hand dyers that are doing it all themselves, and that process of rinsing the yarn is physically demanding and time consuming. So I think sometimes dyers get in a rush, or they genuinely think they've rinsed it as best they can, and maybe they even have, but maybe it didn't get the one last rinse that it needed, and that leaves excess dye in the yarn that's ready to kind of come out. Other times it just kind of has to do with dye techniques. There are certain dye houses and dye companies that are notorious for having yarn that bleeds a little bit or tends to bleed more frequently than the average. So that has nothing to do with you. It just has to do with how the yarn was dyed and processed. Another reason that it can happen is just that there are certain colors that tend to bleed more regularly. We see this in our store-bought clothes too. If you've ever purchased a bright red sweatshirt and then just thrown it in the wash with all of the rest of your stuff, you might end up with pink splotches on other things. Red is one of those colors that just tends to bleed. You also see it with really deep and saturated colors in store-bought things too. You get that denim, I'm pointing to my legs because I'm thinking jeans. You get that denim that has that warning on it that's like, hey, this might bleed all over the place. And those deep saturated colors can just, no matter how much they're rinsed in the initial process, bleed a little bit or release some dye just because of the really deepness of the color. Saturated color. So another reason why it happens can be with how you wash and block your handmaids. Color will tend to bleed more the warmer the water is that you use. The other thing is, and I haven't experimented with this because I have a wool wash that I love, but it is potential, especially if you're not using a wool wash, you're just using a detergent to wash your handmaids. It could be that that detergent is stripping some of that color out and might be causing more bleeding than if you would use a more appropriate wool wash. I'll link my favorite wool wash in the show notes below so that if you're on the hunt, you can just go pick some of that up. It's tried and true. Okay, so step 2, let's talk about when you are most likely to have color bleeding, because there are certain circumstances where it's more common. So as I said before, bold colors and red colors tend to be more susceptible to color bleed. Does that mean you should avoid those colors? I'm not going to. The other end of the spectrum is undyed yarns. Undyed yarns, or bare natural fibers, tend to be ready to soak up dye. So if you are doing a shawl, let's just say a shawl, it's red and a bare yarn, the likelihood that the red sheds some dye is probably pretty good, and the likelihood then that the bare yarn sucks up that dye is also more likely. Whereas if you were doing a red yarn and another dyed color of yarn, it's maybe less likely that even if that red sheds some of its dye, that it will get sucked up by the other color. As I said before, the hotter the water, the more likely the yarn is to shed and absorb dyes. Hot water opens up the scales of the yarn and not only allows the releasing of the dye, that's what this is, the releasing, but also the absorbing of the dye. So hot water, if you're a person who's like, oh, I really like to get my things clean, and so I'm gonna use hot water, there are definitely times to avoid that. The last thing that I'll suggest, and this is just very anecdotal and like, it makes sense in my brain, but is it science? Probably not. My thought is that leaving projects to soak for too long might encourage the absorption of dye. Now, I don't know. I tend to be a person who will fill up my basin, my sink, with water, put my project in it, walk away, forget that I did it. I'm not kidding you, I just did this. Walk upstairs at bedtime and be like, oh, there's my shawl still in my sink. If you are worried about color bleeding, doing that is probably not the best idea. Because what do yarn dyers do but leave the yarn soaking for a certain amount of time so that it has time to absorb that yarn. Absorb the dye. So if you're worried about color bleeding, leaving the yarn soaking for an extended period of time is probably not the best idea. Okay, so now the most important part. What are you gonna do about it? Because maybe you've already made up your sweater in red and bare fiber and it's got to be washed. So let's talk about a few things you can do to avoid the color bleeding. The first thing you can do, which is kind of a pre-step, or it could be a post-step if you've already made up your project and now you're worried about it, and that is to test the yarn out for color bleeding. So what you can do is take just a little jar or drink cup. I recommend this be clear I'm thinking I have lots of glass mason jars around, and that would be perfect for this. So you're gonna put a little wool wash and some hot water in there. Okay, you're gonna take a little bit of your yarn, just a little bit, it doesn't have to be a lot. You're gonna stick it in that jar, you're gonna stir it around a little bit, you're gonna leave it, and you're gonna see if the color seeps out of the yarn. That's kind of step number one. If you get a lot of color seepage, I would do that again and put cool water in there and see if you get the same seepage, because you might not. So the solution to that whole thing might just be to do your washing in cold water. The other thing to check on is, just because yarn seeps dye does not necessarily mean that other yarns are going to soak that up. When I blocked my Lumi shawl last year, so it's a giant shawl, all the rainbow colors, it seeped some of the red dyes, but they just hung out in the water. They did not reabsorb into other colors, so it was totally fine. My point being, just because the yarn seeps some dye doesn't mean it's going to be reabsorbed. So if you're really concerned about that and you see some seepage with that test, you can go ahead and now redo the test, and instead of putting the one color in or putting your multiple colors in separate, throw them all together and see, okay, so I know this one seeps, but is that other color going to soak up the yarn? Is this 100% guaranteed, meaning you're definitely not or going to get, you know, color bleeding? Not necessarily, but it can ease your mind a little bit to know, okay, I have this red yarn, I have put it in water, it hardly leaked dye at all, and when I put it in with some of my natural yarn, that natural yarn did not absorb the color. So a little peace of mind. However, as I said, that's not 100% guarantee that just because that test worked, that once you get your whole project into the basin, that there's not going to be color bleeding, and that that's still definitely not going to absorb the seeped dye. So my other tips for how to avoid the color bleeding, or maybe even not the color bleeding so much as the reabsorption of the dye by other yarns, are this. Cool water. Doesn't have to be cold, you don't need to stick ice in it, but you know, run your tap on cold instead of on warm or hot, and that helps keep the scales of the yarn closed, and so it both will be less likely to release the dye and absorb any dye that gets released. Also, as I said before, avoid soaking for hours and hours like I accidentally tend to do. Set a timer. What you want is for all the fibers to have absorbed the water and be really saturated with the water. It's not like soaking them for 3 hours is better than 30 minutes. 15-20 minutes is plenty of time. If you are either worried about the color bleeding, even if you've done the test, or you knew from your test that one of your yarns did bleed dye, go ahead and put a color catcher in with your wash. A color catcher is a commercial product. It's not made specifically for handmaids or woolens by any means, but the purpose of it was to be able to just throw a bunch of clothes into your laundry, toss in a color catcher, and not have to worry about colors mixing and depositing on other pieces of clothes. So it is designed specifically to absorb that extra dye so that it doesn't get on other things. The one thing I would caution you about with that is that that is for commercial laundrying use. That's not a handmade specific product. I don't have a ton of experience using it with my handmaids, and so could it maybe something in there affect the yarn? I guess maybe. I do, however, know anecdotally that lots of people have used it with great success. I believe color catchers are pretty widely available, at least within the United States. I'll put a link below, maybe to like an Amazon or something that hopefully kind of everybody could order from, but I just get mine at Target. So there you go. I hope that helps ease your mind about color bleeding and that you can have a relaxed and not frightening Halloween and blocking session. All right, let's talk small businesses. I brought out my black and white mug to go with my black and white shawl and my black and white earrings. This is from Jane Ann Deemer's Pottery, link below because I'm sure that I did not pronounce her name correctly. Got this at Art in the Park this summer. It was so much fun. And then I have earrings. Gosh, I'm really going Art in the Park here. From 2 summers ago at Art in the Park. These are just the most fun earrings. These are by Cloudy Sky Designs. You guys, this earring is made out of wallpaper. So it's really, you know, it's more durable than just paper, but it is also super lightweight. I really love them. They're super fun. So I will link to both of these small businesses in the show notes. Go check them out. She also has more reasonably sized earrings too. Lots of cute stuff from her. Couple real quick announcements. The Crochet Cancer Challenge is still going on. I'll put a link in the show notes below. Check out those hats for the next few days. Remember that this is for charity, so designers are offering free patterns and crocheters are pledging to then make a hat from that pattern to go to charity. It's a win-win for everybody. All right, I'm gonna take off my shawl for this next announcement. You guys, I have been working on my Rain Haven cardigan and I'm very excited. I'm gonna do a whole video on, it almost matches my shirt. I'm gonna do a whole video when I'm done about how I found the pattern to work up, what changes I made to the pattern. I'll tell you about my yarn mistake at that point too. But guys, I'm really thrilled. Look at this. I'm down. I've like joined for the body. Look at that. Not quite a bolero here. I am using yarn that I had in my stash from long ago. I purchased it as it was discontinuing, so I definitely can't get more of this. So what I'm gonna do now is I've got the body and I'm going to pause now. I finished like a ball of yarn and so I don't have a bunch of yarn hanging off. So I'm going to take a pause on the body. I'm going to work the sleeves so that I make sure I have enough yarn for the sleeves. And then I think I'm going to kind of see what I have left over and make the body as long as I can. And then I have another color that I'm going to do for the ribbing around the neck. There's color work and I'm going to use that color for the color work and the ribbing on the cuffs and the bottom of the cardigan. So my goal is to both have a cozy cardigan that I'll really enjoy wearing and to really use up a bunch of yarn from my stash. If you would like to make the Rain Haven cardigan right along with me, I will link the pattern in the show notes. It's not one of my patterns. I have so far found it really user-friendly and quite adjustable. I have made a few adjustments that, again, I'll tell you about when I finish it up. That's all I have for you today. Links to all the things are in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love it if you would like, subscribe, share with a friend. I love to build a community here of crocheters who are excited to learn. We will see you back here next week. Have a great week and happy crafting.